You smell the earth before you see it. Not the clean earth of the cornfields of Indiana where you grew up. Not the dark and fertile earth your father turned with the John Deere plow every spring, while you walked behind him barefoot, feeling the cold clods crumble between your toes. But another earth. An earth that smells of something your brain takes several seconds to classify, and that once it classifies it, you wish it had not. It smells of wet clay, of rotted roots, of human excrement fermented for months in darkness, of something sweet and nauseating that is the chemical residue of organic decomposition in a tropical environment with 94% relative humidity and a constant 37 degrees of temperature below the surface. And beneath all of that, like a low note in a symphony of pestilence, it smells of death. Not fresh death, but old death. Death that has spent weeks or months integrated into the walls of laterite clay, like a pigment, like a geological layer of horror that deposited slowly with every body someone left to rot in some bend of this subterranean labyrinth that extends beneath your boots, like the circulatory system of an organism that your lieutenant's map calls the Ku Chi Tunnel Complex. But that you, in the reduced and brutal vocabulary you have developed during the 7 months you have been in country, call simply the hole. And you are about to go in. You are 20 years old. You stand 1.63 meters and weigh 61 kilograms, which makes you the shortest man in Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. And that height which in Terre Haute, Indiana, earned you the nickname Half Pint, and the chronic inability to get a date for the senior prom, here, in Binh Duong Province 60 kilometers northwest of Saigon, in January of 1967, has turned you into something you did not know existed until you set foot on this red and soaking earth. It has turned you into a tunnel rat. You did not volunteer. Nobody volunteers to be a tunnel rat the same way nobody volunteers to stick their hand into an industrial grinder. What happened was simpler and more unjust. First Sergeant McCready, a man from Kentucky with 38 years and 2 tours in Korea, and a gaze that looked as though it had been boiled until all the compassion evaporated, looked you up and down on the second day after your arrival at the base camp, pointed at the entrance to a tunnel that a patrol had discovered that morning between the roots of a rubber tree, and said 4 words that redefined your existence. You're small. Go. He did not say please. He did not explain what was inside. He did not mention that the man who went into the last tunnel, a corporal from New Jersey named Petrowski, who was also short and was also chosen for his height, came out crawling backward with a bamboo spike driven through his right palm from one side to the other, a spike that had been soaked in human feces to guarantee an infection that field antibiotics took 3 weeks to control, and that Petrowski never went into a tunnel again because Petrowski never did anything again with his right hand except tremble. What you carry with you when you enter fits on a list you memorize each time like a secular prayer. Not because you might forget something, but because the repetition is an anchor that keeps you connected to logic when everything around you becomes darkness and sound and smell. And the primitive brain that lives behind your frontal cortex begins to scream that you are inside a grave and that graves are for the dead. You carry a .45 caliber pistol model, 1911, A1 with a 7-round magazine and 1 in the chamber, 8 shots total. A pistol that weighs 1 kilogram, 130 grams, and that in the world above ground is a secondary weapon. But the down here is your solar system, the gravitational center of your tactical universe, because an M16 rifle does not fit in a tunnel 60 centimeters wide, and besides the recoil in an enclosed space would shatter your eardrums with an acoustic pressure of more than 170 decibels, which is sufficient to cause instantaneous permanent hearing damage. You carry a right-angle flashlight with a red filter, a standard army flashlight that runs on 2 D-cell batteries, and that emits a beam of red light that partially preserves your night vision, but that also turns you into a target, a red dot moving in the darkness that any Viet Cong guerrilla posted around the next bend can see from 20 meters away, while you cannot see him because he turned off his light and merged with the clay walls and became part of the tunnel, an organic extension of the labyrinth he built with his own hands. Over years, sometimes over decades, because some of these tunnels have existed since the war against the French, since the 1940s and 50s, and have been dug and expanded, and reinforced and connected to one another until they form a network of more than 200 kilometers of corridors on 3 levels of depth. The first at 3 meters below the surface, the second at 6, the third at 10, with chambers that function as hospitals, kitchens, dormitories, weapons depots, meeting rooms, booby trap workshops, and command centers from which Viet Cong officers plan attacks against your base that is literally above their heads. And that is the geometric madness of this war. The enemy is not in front of you or behind you. He is beneath you. He is underground like a poisonous root that feeds the ambushes and the mortars and the snipers who appear out of nowhere and vanish into nowhere. Because the nowhere has doors and the doors have stairs. And the stairs lead to an inverted world where the rules of combat they taught you at Fort Riley, Kansas mean absolutely nothing. You also carry a K-bar knife with an 18-centimeter blade, 4 NMM26 fragmentation grenades, a signal pistol in case you need to mark a position so the men above know where you are, a canteen, and what the field manual calls tunnel detection and destruction equipment. But that in practice consists of your 5 senses, your spatial memory, your ability to control panic, and a quantity of luck that no manual can quantify. You go in. The procedure is always the same and always different. Always the same because the sequence does not change. You kneel in front of the entrance, which is usually a wooden trapdoor covered with dirt and leaves that makes it indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. A piece of camouflage engineering so efficient that your fellow soldiers have literally walked over tunnel entrances without detecting them. And sometimes the only reason they are discovered is because someone steps on one that has rotted and his leg sinks to the knee into the darkness. And the scream that follows is not a scream of pain, but of pure terror. The terror of the animal that falls into a trap and feels the void closing around its limb. You kneel, aim the pistol into the hole, switch on the flashlight, and descend head first, with your arms extended in front of you and your elbows pressed to your body. Because the entrance tunnel usually has a diameter of between 50 and 60 centimeters. Barely enough for a man your size to pass if he contracts his shoulders and exhales the air from his lungs. And a larger man, a man the average size of the American soldier, who stands 1.75 meters and weighs 80 kilograms, simply does not fit, which is exactly the point. Because the Vietnamese who built these tunnels average 1.60 meters in height and weigh 55 kilograms, and designed the passages for their bodies, not for yours. And that architectural advantage is as deliberate as the orientation of the chambers and the angle of the ventilation shafts that carry smoke from the kitchens through camouflaged exits hundreds of meters away so that reconnaissance helicopters do not detect columns of smoke. Always different, because what lies at the end of the first stretch changes every time. Sometimes a 90-degree bend that forces you to rotate your entire body in a space where you cannot rotate your entire body. Sometimes an empty chamber with food, remnants, and a bamboo cot indicating recent occupation. Sometimes a vertical shaft 2 meters deep that you must descend without a ladder, gripping notches carved in the clay with your fingers. Sometimes a trap. The traps are the artisanal signature of this war, and after 7 months, you hold them in a respect that is almost professional admiration. The most common is the punji, a pit covered with a lid of bamboo and earth that, when it gives way beneath your weight, drops you onto sharpened bamboo stakes driven into the bottom with the points facing up. Stakes that measure between 15 and 30 centimeters long, and that are fire-hardened, and sometimes coated with the sap of the Antiaris toxicaria tree, a poison that causes cardiac paralysis, and sometimes simply smeared with excrement that guarantees infections of Staphylococcus, tetanus, gas gangrene, the 3 plagues of the tunnel fighter that the doctors at the Coochie Field Hospital know so well, they diagnose them by smell before seeing the wound. But punges are surface traps. Inside the tunnel, the traps are more ingenious and more personal, designed not to kill platoons, but to kill a single man. You, the one who comes crawling in the darkness with a flashlight and a pistol, and the ragged breathing of someone who knows that every centimeter he advances is a centimeter farther from the exit. There are nail traps mounted on wooden frames that hang from the ceiling and that are triggered by a wire strung at forehead height, so that when you advance headfirst, the wire releases the frame, and the nails fall onto your skull and your back. There are snake traps, bamboo, boxes sealed with wax containing bamboo vipers or banded crates, serpents whose neurotoxic venom causes respiratory paralysis in less than 6 hours, tied with a cord that releases when you open the lid of a trapdoor, freeing the snake into the enclosed space with you. There are unexploded American grenades recovered from failed attacks, rewired with tripwires at the entrances to chambers, so that the enemy kills you with your own weapons, with the same ordnance your country manufactured in a plant in Iowa, and shipped in containers across the Pacific, and dropped from helicopters, and that did not explode when it was supposed to, and is now here, in the darkness, waiting for you. And there is an irony in that which would make you laugh, if laughter were a luxury you could afford at 60 centimeters wide and 3 meters underground. Your third tunnel mission is the one that breaks you. Not all at once, but the way a rock breaks through erosion, layer by layer, molecule by molecule, until what remains is not a rock, but sand. Lieutenant Dawson, a man of 24 from Virginia, who has 4 fewer months in country than you, but a rank that gives him the right to send you where he would not go, tells you that a patrol has located a fresh entrance in a bamboo clearing 2 kilometers north of the base perimeter. Fresh means the disturbed earth is dark and damp, that it has not had time to dry and harden under the sun, that someone entered or exited within the last 24 hours. You reach the clearing with 4 men who stay above and who watch you descend with an expression you know and that you hate. The expression of someone else's relief. The relief of not being you. The relief of standing 1 meter 75 and weighing 80 kilograms and being too big for the hole. You descend. The first stretch is about 4 meters long and descends at a 45-degree angle. The clay is fresh, damp, it sticks to your hands and your knees and your chest like a cold tongue. The air changes composition with every meter you advance. First it loses the component of the outside wind, then it loses the smell of vegetation. Then it gains density and humidity until each inhalation feels like breathing through a wet towel. The red flashlight illuminates 1.5 meters ahead, and within that 1.5 meters, the entire world reduces to a disk of red light on brown clay. A disk that advances with you, like a cyclops eye that flickers with every tremor of your hand. And beyond that disk, there is nothing. Literally nothing. A darkness so total that your brain begins generating phantom images, phosphines, and geometric shapes that float in the periphery of your vision, like luminescent jellyfish in a black ocean. You reach a fork. Right and left. There are no signs. There is no map. There is smell, and the smell guides you the way it guided the coal miners of the 19th century, because you learned, in the 2 previous missions and in the interminable hours of informal instruction that the tunnel veterans gave you while smoking cigarettes with their hands caked in red clay, that the air in the tunnels moves, that the ventilation shafts create subtle currents you can feel on the sweat-dampened skin of your face, and that the direction of the current tells you where there is an open chamber, where there is an exit, where there is a space larger than the tube where you are trapped. You feel the current coming from the left. You take the left. You advance 7 meters, crawling on your elbows and knees through a corridor that progressively narrows until your shoulders brush the side walls, and the ceiling brushes your back, and the claustrophobia, which you have kept at bay during the first minutes with the breathing technique a military psychologist taught you in a 15-minute session at Fort Riley. A session that was supposed to prepare you for this, as though 15 minutes of diaphragmatic breathing could prepare you for crawling through a tube of earth in a country you cannot find on a map toward a darkness that could contain absolutely anything. The claustrophobia hits you like a wave, and you feel the tunnel contracting around you like an esophagus, and the earth wanting to swallow you, and you are being digested by the planet, and the air is running out, and your lungs cannot expand enough, and your heart is beating so fast you feel it in your temples, and in your teeth, and in your fingertips, and your hand grips the pistol so hard your knuckles ache, and a voice inside your head, the voice of the animal that lives behind the frontal cortex, screams, "Go back, go back, go back," but you do not go back. Not because you are brave, bravery has nothing to do with this, but because going back in a tunnel where you cannot turn around means crawling backward without seeing what is behind you. which means you now have two darknesses, the one ahead and the one behind. And at least the one ahead is lit by your flashlight. You advance. The chamber appears suddenly, the way all chambers appear, without transition, without announcement. The tunnel opens, and suddenly there is space. Enough space to kneel, to raise your head, to breathe air that is marginally less dense than the air in the corridor. You sweep the chamber with the flashlight, 3 meters by 3 meters, ceiling at 1 meter 40. A bamboo cot with a folded blanket. A clay container with remnants of rice that is still warm to the touch. An oil lamp made from a recycled American sea ration can. Papers. The papers are what you are looking for, always the papers, because a Viet Cong map, or an orders document, or a list of names is worth more to military intelligence than 100 meters of destroyed tunnel. And you pick up the papers and stuff them into the waterproof bag you carry tied to your belt, and that is when you hear it. A sound that is not a sound, but the absence of a sound. The air current has stopped. Someone closed. Something at some point in the tunnel system, a trapdoor, a cloth curtain, something that altered the airflow, and that means you are not alone. That someone knows you are here. That someone is moving in the darkness with the same intent with which you move, but with an absolute advantage. He knows this labyrinth the way he knows his own body, every bend, every trap, every chamber, every centimeter. Because he built it, he excavated this clay with his hands and with rudimentary tools over years. He was born on this land and grew up on this land, and is willing to die under this land before letting you take it. And that willingness is something you do not have, because you did not come here out of conviction, but because of a letter from the Selective Service that arrived in the mailbox of a farm in Indiana on a Tuesday in October, and that your mother opened with trembling hands, and that your father read in silence sitting at the kitchen table with the same expression he wore when the frost killed the crop. You turn off the flashlight. The darkness is instantaneous and total, a darkness that resembles no darkness on the surface, because on the surface there is always something, a star, a reflection, the phosphorescence of a watch. But down here there is nothing. Your eyes are open, and there is no difference between open and closed, and the darkness acquires a tactile quality. It rests against your face like a damp cloth, and your other senses amplify to a degree that borders on the hallucinatory. You hear your own blood circulating. You hear the creak of the clay settling. You hear something that could be a breath, or could be your own breath reflected off the walls, or could be your imagination manufacturing threats to justify the level of adrenaline in your bloodstream. A level that an endocrinologist would measure in micrograms per deciliter, and that you measure by the frequency with which your finger strokes the trigger of the 45. You wait. Time warps in. The subterranean darkness. The way light warps in a gravitational field. A minute can last an hour, and an hour can last a minute, and you have no reference because your watch has a luminous dial. But looking at it would mean taking your eyes off the darkness, where there may be a man with a knife or a pistol, or a Chinese-manufactured bayonet, aimed at the spot where he calculates your chest to be based on the sound of your breathing, which you try to control, but cannot fully control, because your lungs need oxygen, and the oxygen down here is a limited resource shared with the bacteria, and the fungi, and the roots, and the rats. The real rats, not the metaphorical ones. Like you, Vietnamese field rats that measure 40 centimeters long, and that sometimes run across your body in the darkness, and whose tiny claws scratch your skin with a lightness that is worse than a blow, because a blow at least is honest. You hear him. To your left. A brush of fabric against clay. He is less than 5 meters away. You switch on the flashlight and fire in the same movement. A movement you have practiced 112 times on the surface, until it became a reflex your body executes before your mind processes the image. And the image your mind processes a fraction of a second after the shot is that of a man. A young man, perhaps your age, perhaps younger, in a black uniform and sandals made from truck tires, and a Soviet Tokarev pistol of 7.62 millimeters in his right hand that he never managed to raise because your .45 caliber bullet entered through his sternum, and the kinetic energy of 480 joules at point-blank range destroyed his thoracic cavity and threw him against the clay wall, where he slid downward, leaving a dark mark that is blood mixed with earth, and that in the red light of your flashlight looks like black paint. The gunshot in the enclosed space is a detonation that bursts your eardrums with a pressure you feel like two open palms, striking both sides of your head simultaneously. And for the next 10 seconds, you hear nothing, only a sharp, constant ringing that installs itself in your ear like an acoustic parasite. And that, you do not know this yet, but you will know it in the years and decades that follow, will never fully go away. It will be a permanent companion. A chronic tinnitus that the doctors at the Department of Veterans Affairs will diagnose as noise-induced hearing loss and treat with a hearing aid that does not fix the ringing, but simply adds other sounds to mask it, like playing music to cover up weeping. The man is dead. You confirm it because confirmation is protocol. You illuminate the body, verify there is no respiratory movement, verify he does not have a grenade in his hand with the pin pulled. A trick that Viet Cong guerrillas use as a final act of war, pulling the pin on a grenade and clutching it to their chest so that when the enemy approaches to check the body, the grenade detonates and takes them both, the dead and the living, the Vietnamese and the American, together to the other world in an embrace of shrapnel that does not distinguish uniforms. He has no grenade. He has the Tokarev pistol, which you take from his hand and put in your bag because captured weapons are intelligence. He has a notebook with Vietnamese writing you cannot read, but that the translators at the base will decipher. He has a photograph in his shirt pocket, a black and white photograph the size of a postage stamp, blurry, bent at the corners, of a young woman holding a baby. And you look at the photograph for 3 seconds that are enough for the image to engrave itself in your memory with the permanence of a tattoo. And you put the photograph in your bag, along with the notebook and the pistol and the papers from the previous chamber. And you do not think about the woman or the baby because you cannot afford to think about the woman or the baby. Not now, not here, not in a tunnel 3 meters. Below the surface of a country, you do not want to be in killing men. You do not want to kill in a war. You do not understand for a government that did not ask whether you agreed. You begin to retreat, backward, centimeter by centimeter, crawling on your elbows over the wet clay that now also has the dead man's blood on it. Blood you feel warm and slippery beneath your forearms, and that has the consistency of motor oil and the smell of rusted iron amplified by the confinement until it becomes something almost solid, something you can chew. You come out. The sunlight hits you like a slap from God. Your pupils, dilated to their maximum during 47 minutes of darkness, contract with a pain that radiates from the eyeballs to the base of the skull. And for several seconds, the world above ground is a white explosion without shapes or detail, only pure luminosity, and you remain kneeling beside the tunnel entrance with the pistol still in your hand and the red clay covering your entire body. Like a second skin, and another man's blood on your forearms and your chest, and the men above look at you with an expression that is a mixture of relief and disgust, and something they will never say aloud, but that reads in their eyes the way a headline reads in a newspaper: fear. Not fear of what is in the tunnel, fear of you. Fear of what the tunnel does to you. Fear of the visible transformation that occurs every time you come out. Because you come out different. Each time a little more different, a little quieter, a little slower to respond when someone says your name, a little quicker to snap your head when you hear an unexpected sound, a little more like the tunnel veterans who have been going down into the holes for 6 months, or 9 months, or 12 months, and who have the eyes of men who have seen something that language cannot transport from one brain to another. Something that stays inside the way the clay stays under your fingernails, no matter how many times you wash them. They send you down into others. They lower you into others. You lose count after the 10th. Each tunnel is a new world, with the same rules and different horrors. In one, you find an underground hospital with bamboo cots and bottles of penicillin stolen from the South Vietnamese army, and a rusted scalpel and cotton bandages stained a brown that was once red, and a smell that is the smell of human infection, concentrated in an unventilated space. A smell that is living flesh rotting on living flesh, and you find 3 wounded men who cannot move and who look at you with eyes that express not fear, but something more complicated. Something that takes you years to identify as resignation. the resignation of someone who knows how the story ends because he has watched it end this way for others. You shout at them in English to surrender, knowing they do not understand English, and they do not raise their hands and do not make any gesture of surrender, and you do not know whether it is because they do not understand or because they prefer to die. And the protocol says that an enemy combatant who does not surrender is a hostile combatant, and a hostile combatant in a tunnel is a lethal threat. And you pull the trigger 3 times, and each shot is a thunderclap that crushes the air. And the conscience, and something else that has no anatomical name, but that poets would call the soul if poets were here, but poets are not here. Here, there is only you and 3 men who 20 seconds ago were alive, and who are now part of the clay wall. And you come out, and the sun hits you. And you do not cry, because crying is a luxury you cannot afford, because tomorrow there is another tunnel. In another, you find an underground kitchen with an ingeniously designed stove whose smoke passes through a system of condensation chambers that cool the gases and disperse the residue at ground level through exits camouflaged among termite mounds so that the smoke emerges cold and transparent and undetectable by the infrared sensors on the helicopters. And you look at that engineering with a respect that shames you to feel, because respect for the enemy is an emotion that training tells you must not have, but that intelligence tells you is inevitable when the enemy demonstrates a technical capability that surpasses your own, using materials that do not exceed the technology of the Bronze Age. In another, you find a weapons depot with AK-47 assault rifles of Chinese manufacture, Soviet RPG-2 rocket launchers, anti-personnel mines, ammunition crates wrapped in plastic to protect them from humidity, and plastic explosives that the engineers of your battalion will identify as C4 of American manufacture, captured in some ambush, repurposed against you, and the circularity of that violence, your own explosive buried in your own tunnel, waiting to kill you with your own technology, has a symmetry that turns your stomach more than the smell of death. They pull you out of the country. In August of 1967, with a personal statistic that no one asks for, and no one wants to hear. 17 tunnel missions, 4 confirmed enemies killed by your hand, a wound on the left forearm from a fragment of a nail trap that became infected with methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And that left you a scar the size of a playing card, a perforated eardrum that the otolaryngologist at the Bien Hoa Hospital partially repaired with a tissue graft that restored 38% of the hearing capacity in your right ear, and a diagnosis that in your military file appears as combat fatigue reaction, because in 1967, the Army still does not have the institutional honesty to call things by their real name, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the brain reconfigured by repeated exposure to the certainty of imminent death in an enclosed space from which you cannot escape. A brain that no longer distinguishes between the safe darkness of your bedroom in Indiana and the lethal darkness of a tunnel in Cu Chi. A brain that interprets every enclosed space as a trap, and every unexpected sound as an enemy, and every smell of earth as the prelude to something that wants to kill you. You return to Terre Haute in September. Your mother embraces you at the airport, and you smell her perfume. A perfume that has not changed since you were 5 years old, and that makes you cry, not from the emotion of reunion, but because the normalcy of that scent, the sensory stability of something that smells exactly as you remembered it, collides against the library of smells you accumulated in the tunnels. And the collision produces an emotional short circuit that your body expresses with tears before your mind can decide whether it wants to cry or not. Your father shakes your hand and squeezes it and says nothing, and his silence is the silence of a man who was at Normandy in '44. And who knows there are questions you do not ask because the answers do not fit inside words. The farm is the same. The cornfields are the same. The porch is the same. But you sleep on the floor beside the bed because the bed is too elevated, and the elevation makes you feel exposed, vulnerable, visible from every angle, and the floor is safer because the floor is lower, and lower is closer to the earth, and closer to the earth is where you learn to survive. And the paradox of that inverted logic, seeking safety in proximity to the same earth that tried to kill you, is a paradox that no therapist at the Department of Veterans Affairs will manage to resolve in the 4 decades that follow. You cannot go into the basement of the house. You cannot go into a closet. You cannot shower with the door closed. You cannot sleep without a flashlight within arm's reach. You cannot hear a 4th of July firecracker without dropping to the ground seeking cover, while the neighbors watch you with a mixture of pity and bewilderment, and their children laugh. Because they do not know, they have no way of knowing that the man lying on the garden grass is not crazy, but is in a tunnel 3 meters below the surface of Vietnam, searching for an enemy who died decades ago, but who is still alive in the darkness behind his eyelids every time he closes his eyes. The years pass the way. Years pass for the men who came back from the tunnels, with the slowness of someone dragging a weight no one can see. You marry a woman named Linda, who works at the county library, and who has a patience you confuse with love, until one day, after 12 years of marriage and 2 children, she tells you in a tired voice that the patience has run out, and that she cannot keep sleeping beside a man who screams in his dreams, and who checks the closet with a flashlight before going to bed, and who cannot embrace his children without going rigid because unexpected physical contact activates a reflex that converts the embrace into a defensive position. Linda takes the children. The farm stays with you. The corn keeps growing because the corn does not need you to be sane in order to grow. You work the land with your hands like your father and like your father's father, and there is an irony that would have destroyed you if you had the emotional energy to process it. You spend your days with your hands in the earth, the same earth, always the earth. The Indiana earth that smells of humus and fertilizer and rain, and that does not smell of death, but that your brain insists on associating with the other earth. The red earth of Kuchi. The earth that had teeth and claws, and men with Tokarev pistols waiting in the darkness. You are 77 years old. You are sitting on the porch of the same white wooden house where you read the Selective Service letter 56 years ago. The porch needs paint. The roof needs shingles. You need things that do not exist in any hardware store or any pharmacy in Vigo County. You need a full night of sleep without tunnels. You need a 4th of July without dropping to the ground. You need to be able to go down to the basement to fetch a tool without your heart beating at 140 beats per minute. You need to forget the face of a young man in tire sandals with a photograph of a woman and a baby in his shirt pocket. You still have the photograph. It is in the drawer of your nightstand, inside a tin box alongside your purple heart and your bronze star, and a piece of red clay you picked up from the ground in Vietnam on the day you boarded the plane home, and that has hardened over the years into a stone. A stone you sometimes hold in your hand at night and that you feel for what it is. A piece of planet Earth torn from a place where the planet tried to swallow you, and the photograph of the woman and the baby has faded, and the corners have disintegrated, but the faces are still distinguishable. And sometimes, on summer nights, when the Indiana heat resembles the heat of Binh Duong, and the silence of the countryside resembles the silence of the tunnel before everything begins, you look at the photograph and you wonder whether the baby survived, whether he grew up, whether he has children, whether he knows that his father died in a hole of clay at the hands of a farmer from Indiana who did not want to be there and who has spent 56 years crawling backward through a tunnel he never managed to get out of.